Hi everyone, I'm Nadia, and in today's video, I'm going to be sharing some of my resin do's and don'ts. And let's get right into it. Do make sure that you have all of the proper safety equipment. This includes nitrile gloves, a respirator mask, and working in a well-ventilated area. You'll want to make sure that your gloves are 100% nitrile gloves in order to properly protect your hands while you're working. Wearing a respirator mask and working in a well-ventilated area is crucial, especially if you're using tools to warm up your resin like a heat gun or a torch gun, which can cause your resin to release toxic fumes. A good way to make sure that you are working in a well-ventilated area is to always keep your window open while you're working, and having an air purifier really does a lot as well. Not only will an air purifier keep the room clean, but it can also minimize the amount of dust particles and fibers that you have in your room, which could fall onto your resin piece while it's hardening. This don't goes hand in hand with the do, which sounds kind of weird, but don't disregard these safety measures. A lot of people, unfortunately, don't take the safety measures very seriously and work with resin without a mask or gloves, and this can lead to serious health issues down the line. Do figure out which type of resin works best for the type of project that you're working on. There are so many different types of resins and different viscosities of resin. Low viscosity resin, for example, is the best to use when you're casting flowers and creates less air bubbles than a medium or high viscosity resin would. So to ensure that your project goes as smoothly as possible, it's best to find out what type of resin is best for you. For example, we love to use craft resin, which is a low viscosity resin, and the majority of projects that we work on in coasters, trays, clocks, low viscosity resin really works great for the effects that we're going for. It also has a beautiful shiny finish and has a heat resistance up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit or 90 degrees Celsius, which also makes it a great resin to use for top coating. I'll have a discount code linked in my description if you want to try them out. Don't ignore your room temperature. Very high or low temperatures can cause problems while you're working with resin and can also cause problems for its curing process. When the temperatures are too high, it causes your resin to heat up faster than it normally would, which leads in a decrease of work time. So if your resin's work time is typically 30 minutes in a very hot room, that time can cut down into half. And very cold temperatures can cause for your resin not to harden at all. The ideal temperature to work with resin is 21 to 24 degrees Celsius or 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Don't use a torch gun with alcohol inks. A torch gun is our favorite tool to use to easily get rid of any air bubbles, though you want to keep in mind that alcohol is flammable. So if you have a good amount of alcohol ink in your resin pour and you use a torch gun, it will catch fire. Do read the instructions on your resin bottle. Every resin is different and has a different work time, pouring ratio, and these are all things that you need to be certain of before you start working. Some resins go by weight, some go by volume, some are a 2-to-1 ratio, some are a 1-to-1 ratio. There are all different types of ratios out there, so before you start working with your resin, you need to make sure that you've read that clearly. I get a lot of questions on my channel regarding the pouring ratio, and as I mentioned, this really varies from resin to resin. I talked about craft resin earlier, which is a 1-to-1 ratio by volume. Now, just because my resin is a 1-to-1 ratio by volume does not mean that your resin will be. So again, please be sure to check this, because if you pour the wrong ratio, a lot of problems will occur. The main problem is that your resin piece will probably never harden. Knowing your resin's work time ahead of time is also very helpful, because if your resin's work time is a little bit on the shorter side, you can make sure to have everything that you need prepared ahead of time and on your table so that you're not wasting time looking for the stuff that you need. There are resins that have a 1-hour work time, and depending on your project, that will give you plenty of time to search for what you need after you've mixed. Don't work in high humidity. Working with humidity can be fairly annoying when working with resin and does cause problems. The number one problem is getting blush or film on your surface, and this can prevent you from achieving a perfect top coat. So that is another thing you want to take into consideration along with the weather, is the percentage of humidity. Of course, on rainy days, the humidity will be higher, so I tend to avoid top coating on rainy days so I don't encounter any problems. We have definitely had our fair share of getting that blush on our top coat and having to re-top coat many times. They say that the humidity level should be below 80%, and ideally is around 50%, though through experience we found that our ideal is 65% or lower. Though if you do get this blush on your piece, you can lightly sand it and re-top coat it on a day where the humidity level is not too high, and that will just disappear. Do prepare everything that you need ahead of time. This ties in with what I mentioned earlier with your resin's work time, and having everything out and ready to use can make things a lot easier. Not only will you save time while working on your pour, but you'll also have a little bit more peace of mind by not having to go frantically look for something that you need. I don't know about you guys, but my art room gets pretty messy, so sometimes finding things that I need can take a little bit longer than what they should. So having that all ready and out on the table allows you to gear more focus into your project. Don't forget to mix the bottom and the side of your cup. While mixing your Part A and B resin together, it can be easy to kind of forget about the bottom and side area of the cup and focus mainly on mixing in the center. Though this can cause for your resin not to be mixed properly, which will again cause problems in its curing process and hardening process. Do mix slowly and thoroughly. Mixing slowly can help to avoid extra air bubbles in your resin. Though if you do often encounter problems with air bubbles in your resin, we recently tried out the Resiner's vacuum machine and it really does wonders. I'll leave a link to a video above so you can check it out, and if it's something that you'd be interested in, I also have a discount code linked in that video. Don't just color your resin with whatever. I would recommend using pigments that are specifically for resin. This can include mica powders, pigment pastes, alcohol inks, and even acrylic inks. If you add too much pigment, it can also stop your resin from curing properly. We have experimented with acrylic paint in resin, though with this type of pigment you especially want to be careful of the ratio because it's very easy to add too much and lead to problems in your resin. Generally, a small amount of pigment goes a long way, especially if your pigments are high quality. You really won't need too much. Typically, it's advised to use 1 teaspoon of pigment per 4 ounces of resin. Also keep in mind that different pigments will give you different effects in your resin. Do repot your resin and mix again. This is something that I talk about all the time in my videos and is something that I practice every time that I work with resin. And this is mainly because when I first started working with resin, I had a fair share of fails where I didn't mix my resin thoroughly enough, so my coasters would come out bendy and they would never harden properly. This, of course, is very frustrating, so after that happened, I always made sure to mix my resin thoroughly no matter what to avoid that from happening. So if you ever end up with bendy coasters or trays, this is likely caused by not mixing your resin well enough. Don't sand your resin without a mask. While sanding your resin, a lot of dust particles will go flying in the air and you will end up breathing them in. These can be harmful to your lungs, so to avoid that from happening, it's always a good idea to wear a respirator mask as well as gloves while sanding your resin piece. We also like to pour a little bit of water on a resin piece before we start sanding, and this minimizes the amount of dust that goes flying in the air. You should also allow your resin piece plenty of time to harden before you start sanding, because if your resin is still in its curing process and you're sanding and those particles go flying and you breathe them in, you don't want those little particles to be in their curing process in your lungs. This also applies to mica powders. A lot of the times when you're pouring in mica powders, you'll see a little dust cloud fly into the air and you will probably end up breathing that in. So it's also a good idea to wear a respirator mask when working with mica powders. Do pop air bubbles. This is something that I already lightly touched on, but is a very important part when working with resin. There are several different ways that you can go about popping air bubbles depending on what works best for you. As I mentioned, I do love to use a torch gun, but I know that a lot of people don't like using a torch gun and encounter problems. It's something that you need to be careful while working with because you want to be moving it very quickly. If you do burn your resin, it can cause a yellow spot in your resin and will also cause smoke to go flying in the air, and you also risk damaging your silicone molds. You can try a vacuum machine like I also mentioned earlier, and is a great way to pop air bubbles without applying heat, but there are also alcohol sprays that can work great. I actually haven't tried that because I'm stuck in my torch gun ways, but you can also try a heat gun as well. Though using a heat gun isn't as efficient in popping air bubbles as a torch gun. Don't get discouraged right away. As with everything, practice makes perfect, and you're never gonna get everything right on the first time. When you demold your piece and it's not exactly what you imagined, it's very easy to get discouraged, but it's also easy to mix up your resin again and give it another go. Resin can be a little tricky to work with because a lot of factors can impact the way that your piece turns out. And these are things like the amount of resin that you pour, the amount of pigment that you add and pour, the temperature that you're working in. There's really so many factors that influence your piece. So if you pour something one day and you try again the next day, chances are it'll never come out identical. But that's also the fun in working with resin, is that nothing can be duplicated 100%. Everything is unique. Do cover your piece. When you're done working on your piece, or especially when you're done top coating your piece, you'll want to cover it with something to avoid any particles or fibers, dust, little hairs getting onto your piece while it's hardening. That's also quite a disappointing part while working with resin, is when you've done a top coat and you think that it's perfect and you come back the next day to find a little hair on it or something similar, and then you have to top coat it all over again. So a good way to avoid this is to cover your piece. I have a dog that sheds like crazy, so this is something that I am constantly practicing. And that is all from me for today. I could really sit here and go on forever, but I do have other videos on my channel that touch on similar subjects for beginners that I will leave linked above. If you have a subject that you would like for me to touch on, feel free to leave a comment below, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a thumbs up as well. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and follow me on my Instagram, Summer Girl Designs, and my mom's Instagram, Wild Heart Resin Art.